Every year, more than 10 million people push into a single room in Paris just to stand in front of one small painting. It is smaller than most people expect, barely bigger than a laptop screen, hung behind bulletproof glass and a velvet rope. And yet for 5 centuries, this one image has outlasted empires, wars, and the artist who painted it. Her name is Lisa Gherardini, and the painting is her portrait, but almost nothing about her story is settled. She was stolen from this very room, hidden for 2 years, and hunted by detectives who questioned the wrong men, including a young Picasso. Her smile has been explained by neuroscientists. Her face has been X-rayed for hidden portraits underneath, and her eyes have been searched for secret codes. Some of those claims turned out to be real science. Others turned out to be nothing more than clever fiction mistaken for fact. So who was she? Why did Leonardo never hand the painting to the man who paid for it? And how did a small merchant's portrait end up the most famous artwork on Earth? This is the full story behind history's greatest art mystery: the woman, the painter, the theft, and the science that finally started to explain her smile. To understand her, we have to go back more than 500 years to a wealthy, dangerous, endlessly creative city called Florence. Florence, a city of silk, gold, and genius. In the late 1400s, Florence was not just a city. It was arguably the most creative square mile on the planet. Its wealth came from wool and silk and banking, and that wealth paid for an explosion of art the world had never seen before. The Medici family ruled from the shadows, funding painters, sculptors, and architects the way modern billionaires might fund rockets. Into this world, apprentices trained for years just to learn how to grind pigment and stretch a canvas properly. One of those apprentices had arrived in Florence as a teenager with an illegitimate birth, no formal education in Latin, and an almost unnatural gift for observation. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and by the time he reached his 50s, he was already one of the most famous artists alive, even though he rarely finished anything. He painted in fits and starts, sometimes abandoning commissions for years while he studied anatomy, flight, or the movement of water instead. This obsessive curiosity frustrated his patrons, but it also gave his paintings a scientific precision that no rival could match. Around 1503, a Florentine silk merchant decided he wanted a portrait of his wife, and he chose Leonardo to paint it. It should have been a routine commission. Instead, it became the most studied portrait in the history of art. The merchant's wife. Who was Lisa Gherardini? Most historians agree on who sat for the painting: a woman named Lisa Gherardini, born in 1479 to a family of minor Florentine nobility that had fallen on harder times. At 16, she married Francesco del Giocondo, a successful silk and cloth merchant nearly twice her age, in a match arranged for status and stability rather than romance. Francesco was ambitious and increasingly wealthy, eventually serving as a city official, and commissioning her portrait may have marked a milestone, a new house, or the birth of a son. Lisa herself left almost no written record. No letters in her own hand survive, no diary, no first-hand account of what she thought of the painting at all. Everything we know about her comes from property records, tax documents, and a handful of second-hand mentions by people who knew her family. She raised several children, weathered the plague that swept Florence more than once, and by most accounts lived a quiet, unremarkable life for her era. Records uncovered by historians suggest she died in 1542, at around 63, and was buried in a convent where her daughter had become a nun. She almost certainly never knew her portrait would outlive every king, empire, and museum built in the 5 centuries after her death. For centuries, this identification was treated as settled fact. Lisa Gherardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, nothing more mysterious than that. But as we'll see later in this video, not everyone accepts that this quiet merchant's wife is the whole story behind the world's most famous face. The painter who almost wasn't, Leonardo's life. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman. His illegitimacy barred him from university and most respectable professions, so at around 14, he was apprenticed instead to a Florentine painter's workshop. He proved so talented that, according to legend, his master never painted again after seeing Leonardo's contribution to one shared canvas. By his 30s, Leonardo was working for the Duke of Milan, not just as a painter, but as an engineer, designer of weapons, and stage set inventor. He filled notebook after notebook with mirror-written observations on anatomy, water flow, flight, and light, most of it never published in his lifetime. When Milan fell to French invasion in 1499, Leonardo lost his patron and his home and returned to a Florence that had changed while he was away. By the time Francesco del Giocondo approached him in the early 1500s, Leonardo was in his early 50s, restless and between major patrons. It's likely he needed the commission, but everyone who has studied his notebooks agrees that money was never really what drove Leonardo's brush. What he wanted was to solve a problem no painter had solved before: how to make paint capture something as fleeting as a living human expression. That obsession is exactly what he brought into the room the day Lisa Gherardini first sat down to be painted. A portrait begins. Leonardo's process was unlike anything his contemporaries practiced. He didn't rush through sittings. He studied his subject the way he studied a river or a wing. Contemporary accounts describe him hiring musicians and even a jester to keep his sitter's expression relaxed and natural, rather than stiff and formal. He posed her in a 3/4 turn, hands folded calmly in her lap, a pose so natural it would become the template for portraiture for centuries afterward. Behind her, Leonardo painted an imagined landscape of winding rivers and impossible mountains, blending fantasy with the real woman in front of him. Rather than sharp outlines, Leonardo built her face from dozens of nearly invisible layers of translucent glaze, applied so thin some are only a few micrometers thick. Modern scans have counted as many as 30 individual layers of paint in some areas of her face, built up patiently over what may have been years. Most painters of the era finished a commissioned portrait within months. Leonardo kept returning to this one for years, unwilling to call it finished. By the time Francesco del Giocondo might reasonably have expected delivery, Leonardo had moved on to other cities, other patrons, and the painting stayed unfinished in his workshop. There's no record the del Giocondo family ever received the portrait they paid for. Instead, Leonardo appears to have simply kept it. That single decision, an artist quietly keeping a client's commission, is the reason this painting exists in France today instead of a private Florentine home. The secret in the brushstrokes, Sfumato explained. So why does this particular portrait feel so alive, even 5 centuries later? The answer lies in a technique Leonardo himself helped perfect, called sfumato. Sfumato comes from the Italian word for smoke, and it means eliminating hard outlines, letting colors and shadows melt into one another. Most portraits of the period used crisp lines to define a mouth or an eyelid. Leonardo refused to use a single hard edge anywhere on her face. The result is most visible at the corners of her mouth and eyes, the exact areas our eyes rely on most to read another person's expression. Because those edges are soft rather than sharp, her expression seems to shift depending on exactly where you look and how closely you look at it. Leonardo achieved this by applying dozens of paper-thin oil glazes, each one barely tinted, building depth the way fog builds over a landscape. He also studied optics obsessively, filling notebook pages with diagrams of how light scatters and how the human eye actually perceives distance and shadow. That scientific curiosity is exactly why, centuries later, neuroscientists would return to this one painting to explain why her smile seems to change. But Leonardo's perfectionism came at a cost. He was infamous for taking on too many projects and abandoning most of them before completion. This portrait was one of the very few he kept returning to, carrying it with him from city to city for the rest of his life. Art historians now believe he kept refining it privately for as long as 14 years, using it as a kind of ongoing experiment in his own technique. By 1516, in his 60s and in declining health, Leonardo accepted an invitation from a young French king, eager to have Italy's greatest living artist at his court. Leonardo packed his notebooks, his assistants, and a small handful of paintings, including the unfinished portrait of a silk merchant's wife, and crossed the Alps into France. He would never return to Italy, and he would never deliver the portrait to the family who had commissioned it back in Florence. A King's Prize: How She Came to France. The young king who welcomed Leonardo was Francis I, a larger-than-life monarch, obsessed with matching the artistic glory of the Italian Renaissance. Francis installed Leonardo in a manor house near his own castle at Amboise, granting him a generous pension and near-total creative freedom. In return, Leonardo advised on court festivals, engineering projects, and, according to legend, spent his final years still quietly refining that one portrait. Leonardo died at Amboise in 1519, reportedly with his most trusted assistant at his side, and his paintings passed into the French royal collection. Francis I is widely believed to have purchased the portrait directly from Leonardo's estate for a sum equivalent to a small fortune. From that point on, the painting belonged to the crown of France, not to Italy, and certainly not to the merchant family who had originally paid for it. For a while, it hung in Francis's own bathhouse at the Palace of Fontainebleau, admired up close in private rather than displayed to the public. Later French kings moved it between palaces, and by the 1600s it had become a prized possession of the ever-expanding royal art collection. King Louis XIV eventually brought it to his new palace at Versailles, where it hung among hundreds of other masterpieces collected by the monarchy. For nearly 2 centuries, the painting remained a royal treasure, seen only by nobility, ambassadors, and the occasional privileged guest. Then, in 1789, the French Revolution swept away the monarchy that had owned her, and every royal treasure suddenly belonged to the people of France. The new revolutionary government had to decide what to do with an entire royal art collection, including one small, unusually captivating portrait. From Versailles to the Louvre. In 1797, the former royal palace of the Louvre was reorganized into a public museum, and the portrait was moved there to be seen by ordinary citizens for the first time. It briefly left the museum again when Napoleon Bonaparte, newly crowned emperor, took a liking to it and hung it in his own bedroom at the Tuileries Palace. After Napoleon's fall in 1815, the painting was returned permanently to the Louvre, where it has remained on public display ever since. Through most of the 1800s, it was respected by art scholars, but far from the global celebrity it is today. Just one masterpiece among thousands in a very large museum. Its relatively modest size and quiet color palette meant many visitors walked straight past it in favor of larger, more dramatic history paintings nearby. Art critics of the era admired her technical mastery, but nothing about her early 19th century reputation suggested she would one day become the most recognized image on the planet. That would change with a single, almost unbelievable event, one that had nothing to do with brushstrokes and everything to do with a break-in. In August 1911, this quiet, respected painting was about to become the most famous crime scene in the history of art. The thief was not a criminal mastermind or a rival art collector. He was an Italian handyman who had actually helped build the very glass case meant to protect her. His name was Vincenzo Peruggia, and his motive, at least in his own telling, was patriotic rather than criminal, a mission to bring an Italian masterpiece home. The morning she vanished, the 1911 heist. On Sunday, August 20th, 1911, Vincenzo Peruggia entered the Louvre during regular hours, wearing the same white smock as the other maintenance staff. The museum was closed to the public that day for cleaning, which meant fewer visitors, fewer guards, and far fewer witnesses. Peruggia simply waited inside a small storage closet until the last of the staff had gone home for the night. The next morning, Monday, the museum was closed entirely, as it was every week, giving him hours alone with the collection. He walked calmly to the gallery wall, lifted the painting from its hooks and carried it into a nearby stairwell, completely alone and unhurried. In the stairwell, he removed the heavy protective glass case and ornate frame, wrapped the bare wooden panel in his white workman's smock, and tucked it under his arm. He walked straight out of a side door of the Louvre and disappeared into the streets of Paris, carrying the most valuable object in France under his arm. Remarkably, no one noticed the painting was missing for more than 24 hours. Staff assumed it had simply been removed for official photography. It wasn't until a painter arrived on Tuesday morning, hoping to sketch beside the famous portrait, that the empty wall finally raised alarm. Within hours, the Louvre was closed entirely, and French police launched what would become one of the largest criminal investigations Paris had ever seen. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages within a day, and almost overnight, a painting most Parisians had barely noticed became a national obsession. Crowds actually lined up outside the Louvre just to stare at the bare, empty space on the wall where the painting used to hang. Police investigators dusted the abandoned frame and glass case for fingerprints, an investigative technique that was still relatively new to French law enforcement. They found a partial thumbprint, but with no matching database of the era's workers, it led nowhere for years. Perugia, meanwhile, kept the painting hidden inside a false-bottomed trunk in his small Paris apartment, just a few streets from the Louvre itself. Astonishingly, police searched his apartment during the investigation and still failed to find the painting hidden in plain sight. For more than 2 years, the most famous painting in the world sat quietly in that trunk, while all of Paris and half of Europe searched for it. Perugia later claimed he simply waited, believing the uproar would eventually die down enough for him to sell the painting safely. In the meantime, the empty space on the Louvre's wall became almost as famous as the painting that used to hang there. But before the painting resurfaced, the investigation would take a bizarre detour, one that briefly implicated 2 of the era's most famous artists. The wrong men: Picasso, Apollinaire, and a nation in panic. French police, desperate for a lead, followed a strange trail back to a young poet named Guillaume Apollinaire, a friend of several avant-garde painters. Years earlier, a friend of Apollinaire's had stolen small, ancient statuettes from the Louvre, and Apollinaire had briefly kept them, a detail investigators now seized on. Police arrested Apollinaire, and, under pressure, he implicated his close friend, a young Spanish painter living in Paris named Pablo Picasso. Both men were brought in for questioning, and for a brief, tense period, all of Paris speculated that modern art's rising stars had stolen the Renaissance's greatest painting. In the end, neither man had anything to do with the theft, and both were released, though the ordeal badly frightened them. The real thief, Vincenzo Perugia, was never seriously suspected during this period, despite having worked directly on the painting's protective case. Police had actually interviewed him once, early on, simply because he had once worked at the museum and dismissed him as unremarkable. Months passed, then a year, then nearly 2, with no real progress, and the case slowly faded from the front pages of Parisian newspapers. The public largely assumed the painting had either been destroyed, smuggled permanently out of the country, or lost forever. Perugia, for his part, grew impatient. He had expected the painting to be quietly celebrated as a returned Italian treasure, not smuggled and sold in secret. In late 1913, he finally made his move, writing to a respected art dealer in Florence and offering to sell what he called a stolen Italian masterpiece. The dealer, stunned but suspicious, contacted the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and together they arranged a meeting to verify the claim. Perugia, believing he was finally about to be hailed as a patriot, traveled to Florence carrying the painting, hidden in the same false-bottomed trunk. Found: The Return of the Mona Lisa. In December 1913, Perugia unveiled the painting in a Florence hotel room, proudly presenting it to the art dealer and gallery director as a liberated Italian treasure. The experts examined the panel closely, checking it against known details of the original, including a distinctive crack pattern in the wood, and confirmed it was genuine. They quietly alerted authorities, and Perugia was arrested at his hotel shortly afterward, stunned that his patriotic gesture was being treated as a crime. News of the recovery exploded across Europe. The painting had survived over 2 years, hidden in an ordinary Parisian apartment, completely unharmed. Before returning to Paris, the painting was displayed briefly in Florence and Rome, where enormous crowds turned out to see it one last time on Italian soil. Perugia stood trial in Italy, where public sympathy for his stated motive actually earned him a surprisingly light sentence of about 1 year. In January 1914, the painting finally returned to the Louvre, greeted by cheering crowds and a level of public fascination it had never had before the theft. Ironically, the theft accomplished exactly what Perugia never intended. It transformed a respected but modestly known painting into a global celebrity. Attendance at the Louvre surged in the years after her return, and reproductions of her image began appearing on postcards, advertisements, and parodies worldwide. By the time she was safely rehung on the Louvre's wall, this once overlooked portrait had become the single most recognized image in Western art. But fame, it turned out, would bring new dangers, ones that had nothing to do with theft and everything to do with people who simply wanted to touch history. Attacked, acid, rocks, and a rogue fan. In 1956, the painting survived not 1 but 2 separate attacks in the same year. The first, a shocking act of vandalism by a museum visitor. A visitor threw a vial of acid at the lower portion of the canvas, damaging the paint near the bottom edge of the panel before guards intervened. Later that same year, another visitor threw a rock at the painting, chipping a small fragment of pigment near her left elbow. These 2 incidents convinced the Louvre to finally encase the painting in protective glass, a decision that still shapes how she is displayed today. In 1974, during a rare loan to a museum in Tokyo, a visitor protesting the museum's accessibility policies threw red paint at the glass-protected painting. The protective glass held completely, and the painting itself was untouched, though the incident renewed debate over how far museums should go to protect a single artwork. In 2009, a Russian tourist, reportedly upset over a denied citizenship application, threw a ceramic teacup at the painting, which shattered harmlessly against the glass. Once again, the protective glass installed after the 1956 attacks did exactly what it was designed to do, and the painting itself was never in danger. In 2022, an activist disguised in a wheelchair and wig smeared cake across the protective glass in a climate protest before being escorted out by security. Each incident, decades apart, reinforced the same lesson museum officials had learned back in 1956, that the glass case matters as much as any painted brushstroke. Today, the painting sits behind climate-controlled, bulletproof glass in a purpose-built alcove designed specifically around her protection and the flow of enormous daily crowds. She has also survived war. During the German occupation of France in World War II, museum staff evacuated her in an unmarked truck to protect her from potential destruction or theft. She was moved between several remote French chateaux over the following years, hidden in ordinary crates alongside decoy paintings to confuse anyone searching for her. After the war ended, she was quietly returned to the Louvre, once again undamaged, having survived a theft, multiple attacks, and an entire world war. Given everything this painting has survived, it's almost fitting that even her identity has never been fully settled beyond dispute. So let's return to the question we set aside earlier. If most historians accept Lisa Gherardini as the sitter, why does the debate over her identity still continue at all?
So who was she, really? Competing theories.
The Lisa Gherardini identification comes largely from Giorgio Vasari, a biographer writing decades after Leonardo's death, relying on second-hand accounts rather than first-hand knowledge. A margin note discovered in 2005, scrawled by a Florentine official in 1503, directly names Leonardo as painting Lisa del Giocondo's portrait, strong supporting evidence. That discovery settled the identity question for most mainstream historians. but it hasn't stopped decades of alternative theories from circulating. One theory proposes the sitter was actually Isabella of Aragon, a Milanese duchess Leonardo painted for during his years at the Sforza court. Another candidate is Isabella d'Este, a noblewoman who wrote Leonardo multiple letters begging him to paint her, though no confirmed portrait of her by his hand survives. A more dramatic theory names Caterina Sforza, a fierce noblewoman and military leader, though most art historians consider this identification highly unlikely given the timeline. A very different theory suggests the painting isn't a commissioned portrait of anyone specific at all, but a kind of idealized composite face Leonardo built from memory and imagination. The most psychologically loaded theory, first proposed by Sigmund Freud, argues the smile echoes Leonardo's fragmented childhood memories of his own mother. Freud's theory is considered more literary speculation than verifiable art history today, but it has shaped how generations of viewers read emotion into the painting. A separate and more provocative theory claims the portrait is secretly a self-portrait, with digital overlay studies showing similarities between her features and Leonardo's own face. Most mainstream art historians remain skeptical of the self-portrait theory, pointing out that faint resemblances can appear between almost any two Renaissance faces painted in a similar style. A more recent complication comes from a painting called the Isleworth Mona Lisa, an earlier style version showing a noticeably younger woman in a similar pose. Its supporters argue Leonardo painted an earlier version for Francesco del Giocondo, which was actually delivered, while the Louvre version was a separate, later reworking he kept for himself. Most Leonardo scholars remain unconvinced by the Isleworth painting, arguing its style and materials don't fully match Leonardo's documented technique from that period. A related and better documented discovery is a near-contemporary copy housed at the Prado Museum in Madrid, likely painted by an assistant working alongside Leonardo in his own workshop. Infrared scans of the Prado copy revealed the assistant made the exact same corrections to the pose at the exact same time as Leonardo, proving both paintings were created side by side. That single discovery helped confirm the timeline of the original sittings and further supported the identification of a real Florentine woman posing in Leonardo's workshop. So while the alternative theories make for fascinating speculation, the weight of documentary and scientific evidence still points to one quiet Florentine merchant's wife. Lisa Gherardini almost certainly never imagined that 5 centuries later, scientists and historians would still be arguing over the details of her own face. What almost everyone does agree on, regardless of who she was, is that her expression does something genuinely unusual to the human eye. And that brings us to one of the most well-tested scientific explanations behind the entire mystery: the reason her smile seems to appear and disappear depending on how you look at her. The science of the uncatchable smile. In the early 2000s, Harvard neuroscientist Margaret Livingston proposed an explanation rooted not in mysticism, but in the basic biology of human vision. Our eyes contain 2 different types of light-sensing cells: cone cells packed densely in the center of our vision, and rod cells spread across our peripheral vision. Cone cells are excellent at picking up fine detail, but only when we look directly at something. Rod cells catch blurrier, lower detail information from the edges of our vision. Because of Leonardo's Sfumato technique, the corners of her mouth are painted with soft, blurred shadow rather than a crisp, defined line. When you look directly at her mouth, your sharp central vision picks up the fine detail, and the smile appears to fade or flatten slightly. But when you look instead at her eyes, or anywhere else on the canvas, your blurrier peripheral vision catches the mouth instead, and the smile seems to widen. This creates what researchers now call the uncatchable smile, an expression that seems to flicker brighter the less directly you try to search for it. Livingston tested this by digitally blurring the painting to simulate peripheral vision, and found the smile appeared noticeably wider in the blurred version than in the sharp original. This wasn't a fluke of the eye. It was a direct, measurable consequence of exactly how Leonardo layered his glazes 500 years earlier. In other words, Leonardo may have understood something about human visual perception centuries before neuroscience had the tools or the language to explain it. A separate 2024 study expanded on this research, finding that roughly all viewers perceive slightly different degrees of the smile depending on where exactly they focus their gaze. Researchers even found that viewing the painting from slightly different distances changes how strongly the smile effect registers, adding yet another layer to the illusion. None of this required any hidden code or secret symbolism, just a precise, testable interaction between paint, light, and the biology of the human retina. It's one of the very few explanations in this entire mystery that has been directly tested, measured, and reproduced by independent researchers. But the smile is far from the only place scientists have gone looking for secrets hidden inside this 500-year-old panel of wood and paint. Beneath the visible surface, using tools Leonardo could never have imagined, researchers have found something else entirely, other paintings hidden within this one. What lies beneath? Hidden portraits and X-ray secrets. In 2004, French engineer and imaging specialist Pascal Cotte digitized the painting using a multispectral camera he had built specifically for studying old master paintings. His camera projected 13 different wavelengths of light onto the surface, each penetrating the paint to a slightly different depth beneath the visible layer. Analyzing the reflected light layer by layer, Cotte claimed to have identified traces of earlier, different compositions hidden underneath the final visible portrait. According to his analysis, the earliest layer shows a different, larger composition, possibly an earlier attempt at positioning the sitter that Leonardo later abandoned. A second layer, Cotte argued, appears to show a woman without a veil, seated in a noticeably different pose than the final, finished painting. These findings have generated real excitement, but they remain contested, since scanning technology can sometimes register normal underdrawing changes as if they were entirely separate paintings. Independent researchers have pointed out that revisions and pentimenti, an artist's term for changes made during the painting process, are extremely common and don't necessarily mean separate, hidden portraits. Even Leonardo's own documented working habits, obsessive revision, and years of returning to the same canvas make multiple layers of changes exactly what we'd expect to find. This scientific debate connects directly to the earlier Isleworth Mona Lisa theory, since some researchers wonder if that separate painting reflects one of these same earlier compositions. Other imaging studies have focused less on hidden portraits and more on Leonardo's underlying sketch, revealing exactly how he adjusted her hands and shoulders during the painting process. Infrared reflectography has also confirmed that her now famous eyebrows and eyelashes were likely present originally, but faded away over centuries due to old cleaning attempts and natural aging of the paint. That single finding quietly resolved one of the longest-running visual mysteries about the painting, one that had nothing to do with hidden codes or secret messages at all. Scientific imaging has consistently proven far more revealing than any of the speculative theories that followed the painting's rise to global fame. Every verified scientific discovery about this painting has come from patient, testable analysis, never from a single dramatic breakthrough or hidden secret message. That distinction matters because not every claim made about this painting over the past century has been backed by evidence at all. Some of the most viral claims about hidden codes and secret messages in her eyes have far more to do with modern fiction than 500-year-old fact.
Codes, ciphers, and fiction, separating myth from fact.
In the early 2000s, one Italian researcher claimed to have spotted tiny numbers and letters hidden in her eyes when photographed at extremely high magnification. The claim spread widely online, suggesting the marks might reference dates, initials, or even a hidden numerical code left by Leonardo himself. Independent conservators and the Louvre's own imaging team examined the same high-resolution scans and found the marks were consistent with ordinary cracking and wear in 500-year-old paint, not deliberate symbols. No peer-reviewed art historical study has ever confirmed genuine hidden lettering, numerical codes, or intentional ciphers anywhere in the painting. Much of this fascination with hidden codes was amplified by a wildly popular 2003 novel and later film that wove real paintings into an entirely fictional conspiracy plot. That novel was fiction from the start, built for entertainment, and its author never claimed the puzzles inside were real historical secrets. Even so, the book's popularity blurred the line for many readers between a clever fictional thriller and genuine documented art history. It's worth being clear here. The real, documented mystery around this painting is fascinating enough without needing invented codes or secret societies. A true theft, a genuine 2-year disappearance, real neuroscience explaining her smile, and real multispectral scans revealing hidden layers. That's a remarkable enough story on its own. Separating the documented facts from the viral fiction is exactly what keeps this 500-year-old mystery intellectually interesting rather than just internet folklore. Guarding a national treasure. Today, protecting this single painting is treated with the same seriousness as protecting a head of state, and the security measures reflect that priority. She hangs behind bulletproof, shatterproof glass inside a sealed, climate-controlled case that maintains constant temperature and humidity regardless of the crowds outside. The case itself sits on a reinforced platform, and museum engineers monitor its condition constantly, using equipment far more advanced than anything available in 1911 or even 1956. Discreet security cameras and trained personnel watch the gallery continuously, and the painting has never left French soil for a loan since the 1974 trip to Japan and the US in the 1960s. The Louvre has also redesigned the surrounding gallery multiple times to manage the sheer volume of visitors, since the room can see over 20,000 people pass through in a single day. A dedicated one-way viewing system now guides visitors past the painting in a continuous, carefully managed flow to reduce crowding and prevent damage from constant pressing crowds. Every element of this security, glass, climate control, camera coverage, and crowd flow, exists because of lessons learned from a century of theft attempts, protests, and sheer overwhelming popularity. In a strange way, the very fame this painting gained from being stolen is exactly why it now requires more protection than almost any other artwork on Earth. Why the mystery endures. Legacy. More than 500 years after Lisa Gherardini first sat by that Florentine window, her portrait remains the single most visited artwork on the planet. Part of that fame comes from genuine artistic mastery, Leonardo's Sfumato technique, and obsessive scientific precision still studied by painters and researchers today. Part of it comes from sheer historical drama, a brazen theft, a patriotic thief, wrongly accused artists, and a 2-year disappearance that gripped an entire continent. And part of it comes from real, ongoing scientific curiosity. Neuroscientists studying her smile, engineers scanning her hidden layers, historians still debating the exact woman behind the paint. Every generation seems to rediscover this painting in its own way, whether through art history, criminal history, psychology, or optical science. That layered appeal, equal parts masterpiece, mystery, and crime story, is likely why this particular painting, out of millions created across history, became this singular a phenomenon. Unlike so many mysteries from the ancient world, this one comes with an unusually rich paper trail, tax records, police files, scientific scans, and even a signed confession from the thief himself. And yet, remarkably, that wealth of evidence has settled some questions completely while leaving others, like her exact identity beyond Lisa Gherardini, genuinely open to debate. Maybe that balance, enough answers to satisfy curiosity, enough mystery to keep asking questions, is the real secret behind her enduring, uncatchable smile. If you enjoyed uncovering this mystery with us, subscribe to Clue Series for more of history's greatest unsolved cases. And let us know in the comments which theory you believe.